Many scientists use the term self to refer to the totality of our inner lives. I have attended whole conferences on the self and read books ostensibly devoted to this topic, without seeing the feeling we call I even mentioned. The self that I am discussing throughout this book, the illusory albeit reliable source of so much suffering and confusion, is the feeling that there is an inner subject behind our eyes, thinking our thoughts and experiencing our experience. We must distinguish between the self and the myriad mental states, self-recognition, volition, memory, bodily awareness, with which it can be associated. Consider the semi-fictional condition of a person suffering from global retrograde amnesia, sometimes called soap opera amnesia, wherein a person has entirely forgotten his past. If asked how he came to be this way, he might say, "I don't remember anything." This is overstating the case, for he must remember a thing or two, the English language for instance, to even make such a statement. But there's no reason to think that he is misusing the personal pronoun I. His I seems to have survived the loss of his declarative memories as fully as his body has. If we ask him, "Where's your body?" he might say, "It's here, this is it." If we question him further, asking, "And where are you? Where's yourself?" he would probably say something like, "What do you mean? I'm here too, I just don't know who I am." Strange as this conversation would be, there seems little doubt that our protagonist would feel as much like a self as we do. Only his memories are missing. He, as the subject of his experience, remains to worry over their absence. Of course, as a person, this man is no longer himself. He doesn't remember the names or the faces of his closest friends. He may not know which foods he likes. His private fears and professional goals have disappeared without a trace. We may say that he is scarcely a person at all, but he is a self all the same, and one that is suffering a bewildering dissociation from both past and future. Or consider the condition of a person who is having an out-of-body experience, abbreviated as OBE. The sense of leaving one's body is a staple of mystical literature and has been reported across many cultures. It is often associated with epilepsy, migraine, sleep paralysis, and, as we will see in Chapter 5, the quote, near-death experience. It may occur in as much as 10% of the population. During an OBE, the subject feels that she has physically left her body, and this often includes a sense that she can see her own body in full, as though from a point outside her head. A brain area called the temporal parietal junction, a region known to be involved in sensory integration and body representation, seems to be responsible for this effect. Whether or not a person's consciousness can really be displaced is irrelevant. The point is that it can seem to be, and this fact draws yet another boundary between the self and the rest of our personhood. It is possible to experience oneself as apparently outside a body. The self, as the implied hub of cognition, perception, emotion, and behavior, can remain stable across even wholesale changes in the contents of consciousness, unless the feeling of self disappears. This is not surprising, because the self is the very thing to which these contents seem to refer, not the body or mind per se, but the point of view from which both body and mind seem to be mine in every present moment. Thus we can see that most scientific research on the self is too broad. If the sense of self is the sense of being the subject of experience, it should not be conflated with a wider range of experiences. I refers to the feeling that our faculties have been appropriated, that a center of will and cognition interior to the body, somewhere behind the face, is doing the seeing, hearing, and thinking. And yet in seeking to understand the self, many scientists study things such as spatial cognition, voluntary action, feelings of body ownership, and episodic memory. While these phenomena greatly influence our experience in each moment, they are not integral to the feeling that we call I. Consider the sense of body ownership. It must be produced at least in part by the integration of different streams of sensory information. We feel the position of our limbs in space. We see them at appropriate locations in our visual field, and our experience of touching objects generally coincides with the sight of them coming into contact with our skin. An analogous synchrony occurs whenever we execute a voluntary movement. No doubt our sense of body ownership is essential for our survival and for relating to others. Any loss or distortion of this sense can be profoundly disorienting. But disorienting to whom? When I am lying on the operating table, feeling the first effects of intravenous sedation, and find that I can no longer sense the position of my limbs in space, or even the existence of my body, who is it that has been deprived of these inputs? it is I, the almost ever-present subject of my experience. It should be obvious that no faculty of which I might be deprived, while I remain the subject experiencing the results of such deprivation, can be integral to the self, though it may be integral to my personhood in a wider sense. Several findings in the neuroscientific literature drive a wedge between body ownership and the feeling of being a self. For instance, a person can lose the sense of owning a limb, a condition known as somatoparaphrenia. Conversely, a person's body image can encompass the limbs of others, or even inanimate objects. Consider the famous rubber hand illusion. Each of 10 subjects was seated with their left arm resting upon a small table. A standing screen was positioned beside the arm to hide it from the subject's view, and a life-sized rubber model of a left hand and arm was placed on the table, directly in front of the subject. The subject sat with eyes fixed on the artificial hand, while we used 2 small paintbrushes to stroke the rubber hand and the subject's hidden hand, synchronizing the timing of the brushing as closely as possible. Subjects experienced an illusion in which they seemed to feel the touch not of the hidden brush, but that of the viewed brush, as if the rubber hand had sensed the touch. Amazingly, through the use of head-mounted video displays, this illusion can be extended to the entire body, yielding an experience of, quote, body swapping. It has long been known that vision trumps proprioception, the awareness of the position of one's body, when it comes to locating parts of one's body in space. But the body swapping illusion suggests that visual perception may fully determine the coordinates of the self. The point, however, is that this effect, dissociation from one's own body and a false sense of inhabiting the parts or whole body of another person, seems to leave the self very much intact. Experiments on proprioception tell us nothing about the feeling that we call I, and the same can be said for almost every other aspect of personhood with which philosophers, psychologists, and neuroscientists regularly bundle the self. The feeling of agency, the sense that one is the author of one's voluntary actions, may be as integral to our experience of the world as body ownership, but it too fails to capture what we mean by self. A person could, for instance, distinguish his bodily movements from those of another person without feeling a sense of self at all, for to do so merely requires that he distinguish one body as an object from another. Likewise, he could fail to make such a distinction, in that he might misattribute his actions to another person or ascribe the actions of another person to himself, while feeling the embrace of selfhood all the while. Ascriptions of agency do not define the contours of the self in the way that many people seem to believe. While schizophrenics suffering from thought insertion, delusions of control, and auditory hallucinations may be assailed by unusual mental phenomena, nothing suggests that their sense of being a self has been altered or lost. A person can fail to distinguish between self-generated and world-generated content, and thereby mistake her own internal imagery for sense data. There is a difference, to be sure, between finding a rat in one's bed and hallucinating or merely dreaming about such an encounter. But the feeling of being a self remains constant.